All right.
Well, good afternoon. Tim and I are glad to be talking with each other and with you as part of our conversation. And so, my name, of course, Jason Thornton. This is Tim Rush. And I told you I'd say your name. I'd include you in the conversation. Yeah.
It's part of the contract.
Yeah, that's right. So anyway, so this last Sunday, we did not do the preaching. Really, the bulk of it was done by the teenagers in our congregation, graduates in our congregation, and did a great job. A lot to say there. And that really provoked in me a dynamic of thinking through what our kids have taught us about parenting, about parenting, but also about how God has used parenting to teach us about Him. And then furthermore, how God has used parenting to affect our preaching and the way we communicate. And so I just thought that would be interesting to share. And as with all things, this is a conversation that I'm going to enjoy with Tim one way or the other. So hope you're blessed by it. So Tim, for me, when I read this book years ago called, it was like Dan Allender, Dr. Dan Allender, and it was entitled How Children Raise Their Parents, which of course that's a provocative conversation starter. And the gist of it is recognizing that, yes, he was parenting, so he's not saying he's not parenting, but the impact that God had on him through his kids, not just generically, but specifically through the personalities of his children, things that he thought were really important at one point, and then he'd watch life through their eyes, and God would teach him something different. And so, yeah, I don't know how that resonates with you right now. For me, one of the first things I think about is God has totally reshaped how I think about discipleship and discipling in dealing with my children. If you think of parenting as mainly preparing children for life, that doesn't necessarily cross over to discipleship. And in some ways, you have different goals, or at least different methodologies. And certainly for the first amount of years, you have to, you're trying to keep your kids alive. That's a big goal. And then the second that developed, certainly for me early on, was don't embarrass me. That was really thriving. Honestly, the alive part and the don't embarrass me part vied for, critical primary importance, at times. But I realized that much of my parenting had become don't embarrass me, make me look better as a person. And how that was, if you look at Jesus and how he discipled his people, I mean, they have to be embarrassing all the time to him. They rarely tracked where he was at. They would ask him questions that were often beside the point. Even when he'd tell them specific things not to do, they would still do them. And that's not just his final hours, that's throughout his ministry, if you are watching for that kind of thing. So it was really helpful to me to think in terms of how do I disciple my children, even when my children were relatively young. And the big thing that came away from me is Jesus had laser focus on the end product. And I'm not suggesting because he knew what was going to happen necessarily, but he didn't allow himself to get bogged down in things that were less than the most important things. And man, I think I would have objectively said, yeah, that's ideal. That's who I want to be. But man, kids brought it out to me so much, how I will spend an inordinate amount of time focusing on things that don't matter near as much and replacing the important things in life with urgent things in life. And so that's one of those things that resonated with me. I'm curious, what stands out to you in that?
Well, when I wouldn't have thought of it this way, but when you say the focus of just don't embarrass me, man, so I'm very shame driven in a lot of areas. I've got a lot of shame to clean up, to find better motivations. But one of my big shame things that I carry is how I raise my kids in a lot of ways, particularly when we were with people who didn't have any control of their kids. And um, kids would be running crazy. They would be bullying other kids. And it felt to me like because we are with them, people think those are my kids. And so I wanted to make sure people knew, no, my kids are behaving. My kids are in line. And so I was the worst jerk to my kids when we were with people who I judged did not have well-behaved kids. And it was just about control, and it was about how did I look as a dad, because their kids were out of control, and I didn't want anybody to think that was on me. And so, man, I was horrible. Like I was demanding, I was controlling. I would just take fun out of their life because it made me look bad. And I feel like it was one of those hugely reshaping of our lives when I realized that. When I realized there's no need for me to be getting on to Quincy right now. Those kids can behave however their family allows. And that doesn't mean I need to, because instead of allowing Quincy to be his normal, really well-behaved self, I would clamp it down. And I would make sure, no, you're here, you're quiet, you are not this. And man, it was unnecessary. And it all boiled down to how did I look as a dad? How did I look as a man? So yeah, that's like when you say that, when you say, you know, our job was to keep them alive and not make us look bad. And you can't just brush that under the rug like, yeah, it was just kind of something. No, it was a very big deal. Very big deal.
Absolutely. You know, that makes me think I have to, in terms of what embarrasses someone, you would, if you want trying to define that, I'm just thinking, you know, off the top of my head here, but it's basically, I set a standard, you reflect me because I'm the one in charge of you, you don't meet that standard. Okay. Well, that you don't meet that standard is my everyday 80% of my day, you know, that's my definition. I don't meet that standard. In other words, Christ has said, the Holy Spirit has said, God has said, here's what it looks like to not miss the mark, and I'm below. You know, even if I don't think in terms of, even if I'm not directly sinning, you know what I mean? But that lack of being constantly driven by our faith, of not having to think, oh, I just gave into, you know, an hour and a half of fear. Now I need to transition, you know, instead of just the news comes in and I'm like, man, here's my faith. You know what I mean? So God would be, based on my standards, and especially my standards when my kids were younger, I would be constantly embarrassed by me. Constantly. I mean, constantly having to clean it up. And then we look at him and he's like, man, I took you in your unrighteous state and I made it righteousness. Like, meaning cynically, you could say, I knew you would never get it right. And I mean, never, never, never. So I went ahead and had my son die for you to become righteousness so that you could be righteous as well. And I think that's the dynamic. I think the implication to me as a parent, and it's especially, you know, for those that might be watching that would know, I have a 20-year-old and an 18-year-old boy and a girl. And so with our son in particular, he has some specific, you know, neurological issues. And so just tremendously smart kid. But man, I did not think I had anger issues until he started growing up. And then I was like, oh my goodness, I have anger issues. And initially I would justify it. Well, if he would, using our terminology now, if he would not embarrass me, and I'm talking even at home, you know what I mean? If he would just do basically what I said, then I wouldn't have this problem. Well, that's a classic justification for irrational anger. You know what I mean? Yeah. For, you know, if you behave like I want, you're causing this in me. which is totally giving up responsibility for the power God gives you to submit to him and let him change you with his spirit. And I'm telling you, I feel like, I don't know if I've mentioned it in our discussions, but I think I've said it before, the video where you have a man, he's walking along a screen, and it's just a normal scene. Yes. And he gets right over here to the end, and an enormous hand reaches in and grabs that man and pulls him back to the front of the screen. And it's just back and forth, And Craig Hicks one time said, not speaking of that video, he one time said, God will keep teaching you something until you learn it. And he's really patient. He's not coming in here flicking me, throwing me down, and then dragging me back. He just, okay. And I felt like he did that to me for years. I mean, I deal with my anger so much differently now. And a lot of that's credit to my wife of being gracious and patient, but also direct with me. But had it just been she and I don't think I would have learned the way I needed to learn, And now my relationship with my son is so much better. And it's not because he's matured. Well, it's because he's matured, but it's also because I've matured. But just even that ownership of, this is my fault too. Me getting angry, especially as angry as I get, where I'm like, okay, you want to hit something, and I'll give it back, kind of feeling, that's on me. That's my responsibility to work out. And I don't know that I would have ever realized that without having kids, because most of my relationship, if I get irritated with you, we're done. I just won't come around you anymore. And so, that really speaks to me.
Yeah. So, man, there's so much to unpack and so many questions I even have for myself of my own history that really resonates with me, of not knowing you were angry until you had kids, because I was horribly angry, red-faced, jowls shaking, yelling at my kids. And I wasn't angry with them. I mean, in the moment, I thought I was. But there were so many other things going on in life that I felt out of control, that I couldn't control people's opinions. I couldn't control people's actions. And I didn't show those people my anger. But those, the most out of control people, the weakest link in the chain, my children, they saw my anger, and it would be pointed at them. And so what was it about me that was the only safe place? And I say safe inside my head. I mean, that's horribly wrong, but why would I be angry there and show up that way? Yeah. And there's a lot of shame there, because there were so many years. Kim did a great job of putting up boundaries and saying, hey, this isn't okay. And me thinking, are you kidding? Nobody got hurt there. All I did was yell. I thought I handled that really well. And so there was a lot of relearning of, and I had to finally realize there are other things going on inside my head that I needed to deal with. And it wasn't the 8-year-old in the house that was the problem. It was the 34-year-old in the house.
So good. I mean, so good and so bad. I'm with you, like 100%. I came from a household that would often resort to violence when overwhelmedness would happen. And by degree, I mean, my violence was turned way, way down, but then you have to, it's not how far you've come. We need to honor and celebrate how far we've come. We need to give God glory for that. But the message isn't, look what I've accomplished. The message is, because God has brought me this far, he can bring me farther.
Yeah.
And I think when you say what I hear, and I hear this in men more than women, but I've heard it in women too, is my spouse doesn't appreciate what I've accomplished, and so I'm not going to accomplish anything more until they appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, that I get that. I totally understand, because I remember telling Heather, you don't understand how good I am compared to how bad I was. And a correct answer, though she didn't say this that I remember, you don't understand how bad you are compared to how good God made you to be. And can you see the vision of where God will take you if you submit, if you humble yourself and you start asking him, okay, God, show me.
There's okay, so there's so many different directions to go with this, so feel free to redirect. But I thought about Chad Nancy Schrader when we got to Guadalajara, encouraging us to read a book on parenting, and I think it's Love and Logic, but I'm honestly not sure. But it was all about consequences, allowing your children to live the consequences that happen because of their actions and not stepping in to save them. And Chad and Nancy told us to read this because they said this is the best church planting book you will ever read. And so we were reading it with a vision of how to work in disciple making in Guadalajara. And at the time, Quincy was 2. So our just graduate was 2 at the time. But again, the rub is so often it was, how does it make me look? Because if I'm discipling somebody and I'm allowing them to take leadership or take service or take something that's a part of their spiritual growth and it happens in public and it doesn't go well, that makes me look bad. Sometimes just letting them do something in public makes me look bad because you're the one that's paid to do this. So why aren't you doing it? So then there's this, I've got to control this. And it looks like it's going to fail, so I better jump in and rescue. And so I feel very grateful for this book. I'm not saying that I do this well, but I'm grateful that it's been on my radar for 16 years to try. And oh man, it's one of those things that I can spot it when somebody else isn't doing it. But I often miss it when it's me, when I'm jumping into rescue, when I'm jumping in to make sure everything makes me look okay. But man, that piece of discipleship of letting things not go well. And simple things, your child goes to school and they forget their lunch. And so instead of running up to the school with their lunch, they live the consequences of it. And that either means they buy lunch out of their pocket or they're hungry. And man, that feels like, no way, you can't let your child be hungry. Yeah, you can. And they can learn from it and they become responsible people.
Right.
Sorry, I'm sermonizing.
Yeah, and that goes, no, we're preachers.
Yeah.
If anybody has an excuse to sermonize. That dynamic right there, I think there's a great irony in humanity, and I don't know. I tend to think it's more magnified now, but it's always been around. And I always go back to Jesus himself. Jesus learned obedience through what he suffered, not through what he succeeded in. And it takes you have a different dynamic with Jesus than you do with us, but we can't separate ourselves too far from it, or else we make Jesus inhuman. So he's either human or he wasn't. But if he was human, then he suffered. He didn't know obedience until he suffered. And yet it's funny because I want to remove my kids from suffering until I want them to suffer, especially when they're younger. And suffer seems really harsh, but I want my kids to not have hard things. I want my kids to have better than I have, whatever that means. And I think in our generation, maybe even in the millennial generation, the better there was authenticity, the better there was honesty, the better there was self-esteem, And I think every generation comes to the generation or generations before it and tends to, the pendulum swings, And so we're suffering right now from the pendulum swinging so far to self-actualization that now the dynamic of saying, you know what, a lot of your life is about doing what you don't want to do, but self-actualization says, if I'm not doing exactly what I was born to do, then it's not worth doing, And I was having a conversation with Julia earlier where we're just processing Julia graduated a year ago, so she's been in college for actually over a year now. But the dynamic of uh, just learning subjects in school that you don't feel you'll ever need, and how part of it is content driven. Like, it is good to have some sense of what algebra is or a foreign language is, but part of it's just stretching your mind and doing stuff you don't want to do.
Yeah.
Like we really lose track of how much we grow by doing things we don't want to do. And I think parenting certainly is that kind of thing that I always love the ideal of being a parent and being a dad. I love that ideal. But man, there's so many things you don't want to do.
Yeah.
Small things, big things, just so much.
I was just having this conversation today with David Combs about wondering out loud, do we get more crazy as we get older? Follow me here. But had I not married Kim, my life would look a lot different. I mean, and more than just what you would assume, not having kids, that sort of thing. But I am a homebody, doesn't like to take risks, and likes to be comfortable. If I were not married to Kim, I would probably weigh 300 pounds. I would only eat McDonald's, and I wouldn't spend any time with anybody. And nothing comes up socially that I wouldn't rather be home watching TV. So that's that's really what goes on inside my head, what I would really like. But because I have an outside force that draws me out, then I say yes to things that I don't necessarily want to do. And I put myself in places that I'm uncomfortable, instead of doing everything that would make me feel comfortable, because that's my bent. What makes me feel comfortable?
Yeah.
And so then the other side of that, I was having a conversation with Danny Rucker a few years ago, and he asked me about what's your spiritual giftedness? And it was on the heels of another conversation I don't remember the other conversation, but it was that question that made me ask myself, okay, this is my answer for what my spiritual gifts are, but is that true, or are those spiritual gifts Kim's? And I view her as the ideal Christian. And so I want to be like Kim. And so I just say that to say I have to make a break of understanding Kim is not the Holy Spirit. Kim is not God, and that's not my goal in life, to be like Kim. And these are my gifts, and they're good, and they're okay. However, I also have this is my comfort, and this is what always makes me happy. And boy, does having somebody who's different and driven and social, it pulls me out of my rut, I think is what it would be. I would be in a rut, and there would be no outside force to get me out of it. And that's way too much rambling.
No, it's fun. Well, and what you pointed out there is now you have I didn't want to do what my wife has taught me about God, because that would be a much longer version maybe. But no, it's totally true. And I think our identity comes up in these kind of conversations, because what the dynamics of your relationship with your children pushes on is, who are you really? It's also in your marriage crisis. So when we're in COVID right now, and then the middle of pandemic, and still an enormous amount of unanswered questions, this pushes on, who are you really? Like, what's important about you? That whole identity dynamic. And I think it's good work as long as you're willing to do the work. And I'm not saying the work of parenting as much as I'm saying the work of yourself up to, what will God teach me through these relationships, especially when they're hard. Probably the difference, of course, I mean, one of the big differences between the relationships you have with your children and other people is that with other people, if it gets too hard, I think even subconsciously we just create distance. And I'm not suggesting there aren't parents that create distance with their children, but most parents feel that their connection, their responsibility, their love is enough to overcome the irritation, Now I do think this, and you'd mentioned this, and I want to go ahead if it's okay, and you can always dip back in the first. Let's switch to preaching. The preaching piece of this, like how parenting has affected our preaching. And I want to broaden it from preaching to just leadership as a minister. You know, you had said something earlier that really provoked this thought in my mind that people may want to give it a name other than embarrassment, but I definitely felt growing up, and I mean, my dad preached a different congregation about every 2.5 years. And then we went to multiple churches when he wasn't in preaching. And so I feel like I've got a pretty good repertoire of attending certainly churches of Christ growing up, you know? And so in every one, there was a sense of who was the main voice or voices. And in churches of Christ, that would be the elders, but you learn pretty quick it was one person. In some cases, it wasn't the elders at all. It was a woman that got a lot of stuff, and she would have somebody, and then that's what controlled the church. But it's effectively that same dynamic as the parenting dynamic, in the sense that if as a leader I have to be careful that the primary question I'm trying to answer is, how do I get these people not to embarrass me, or how do I get these people to do what I want them to do, so then I'll feel good about myself as a minister, as an elder, as a leader. And I don't know, I've never had a conversation with anybody that definitively says, I'm trying to figure out a way so they won't embarrass me. But it's the same feel, because I've talked to many ministers that will say, why won't these people basically do what I want them to do? And because what they do is read their Bible in a certain way, or reach out to the neighbor in a certain way, or whatever it is, it feels very spiritual. Let me use another word. It feels very biblical. You know, I'm asking you to do things from the Bible, so it feels very justified. And the thing I would say to like inject into the conversation in your own head is, what would Jesus say to that based on what you see in the New Testament? I mean, Jesus had thousands of people that were hanging on his every word, and he couldn't even get most of them to defend him when he was being killed. Not that he was lobbying for that, but you get what I'm saying. The 12, well, one betrayed him, of course, but the 11 that were with him, they abandoned them. They abandoned him. The guys, you know, he leaves obviously 8 out, and then he takes Peter, James, and John in. He's like, hey, don't go to sleep. And they go to sleep. I mean, you're talking about the Son of God walking the earth, and he couldn't get people to do what he wanted them to do. And I think parenting, a microcosm of the larger discipling opportunity that we all have as leaders, is I don't think the goal is, how do I get these people to do what I want them to do? You know, so that has been, I've been working with that in my heart and head for a while, and I'm not suggesting I have the answer, but I would say, just to, I don't know, let me go to you first, and you don't need to pick up that thread necessarily, but kind of when you think about your preaching, your leadership, what has parenting taught you?
Yeah. So one thing that I'm wondering how this fits in, because I think it goes hand in hand with what you're saying. But I see my go-to desire to be comfortable myself. And for me, that's comfort. I don't even know if that's the right word. It's this numbing autopilot, that there's not conflict, there's not distraction, there's not challenge. It's just turn on the TV and turn the lights off and be distracted. And so, but where my parenting really sparks is when, instead of doing that, I have conversations with my kids. And so, like, maybe there's a fear sometimes of, what if I don't have anything to say? What if my kids look at me like, you're not cool, Dad? You know, what if they roll their eyes? So I feel like as parents, we should admit there's risk. There's risk whenever we try to engage our kids. And my kids don't roll their eyes, and they're sweet and they're kind and they're considerate. So I feel like, why do I still carry these fears that are very real? But whenever I engage them, the most beautiful conversations happen whenever I'm excited about something I'm learning, or I have questions about what I'm learning, and I ask them. And I say, hey, this is something I'm thinking. What do you think? Or this is something I'm learning. Do you see this applying in your life, or how does it apply to you? And I always feel nervous. Like, what if my kids look at me funny? But those are the most promising and rewarding pieces of parenting. And some of it will be when we go on a long walk. And I would never rather go walk than sit. But I wonder about that with leadership. My man, in any phase of life, I would rather not be challenged. But it's the challenge that makes. I think we were talking about this before we got on the call, right? About the food pantry, and I hope I'm not repeating what we've already recorded here. But
before, yeah.
So at the food pantry, I like how it's going right now because a part of the intimacy and connection is taken away. It's much more assembly line, fast paced because we've got more people because of COVID. People are allowed to come more often. And so it's get their names, get some details, and send them to the line where they'll get their food, instead of sitting down with them one-on-one and praying with them. And it's the sitting down and praying with them that I will find the most beautiful moments, where God just shows up in somebody's tears, in words that I feel like God gives me to pray over somebody. But still, if I had to do it my way, it would be like we're doing it now. Less connection, more streamlined, because there's no challenge in that for me. But when the challenge isn't there, neither is the intimacy and the rewards and the gift. So I see that pattern, man, all over parenting, leadership, church work. My go-to easy, nice way is also not the rewarding, blessed, that blessing that I receive from doing it.
Yeah, I love that. You talking about risk. And so the risk would be, instead of asking your kids questions and drawing them in and including them, showing ownership, speaking to them of their, their design, that they were created to be smart and engaging and creative and intelligent and these kind of things. The alternative then would be just to say, bam, here's how it is. Be quiet. Send a real strong message of shut up, And I think that's where that comes from is, for me, how that plays out mentally behind the scenes or emotionally behind the scenes is the recognition that, number one, God loves these kids a million times more than I ever could think. God's much more invested. He has much greater sense of their purpose. My role here is not to manhandle them to some space that I think they should get to, either in their thinking on something or in their life goals. It's to participate with them in God's love. And you have a responsibility of discipline. Now, I think Growing Kids' model of thinking of parenting is like a funnel where you move from strong control when they are born, toddlers, and then you go like this as you age. I think that is a good, construct in our minds. But as soon as they're able to take that on, you include them in the conversation in a different way. That takes an enormous amount of trust, because it's smoother just to say, here's the rules. Here's the rules. I don't care about how God made you. I don't care if there are differences in siblings. Here's the rules, and that's it. That's called legalism. It's where you take something that could be good, but you make a law where God didn't make a law, And so I think it's how I see that playing out in ministry specifically is the idea that that now I think what we can do as fathers, as parents in general, we with our families, meaning God gave me this, so I'm in charge of this space. So then we feel like this huge responsibility to control everything. Well, I think ministers can do the same thing with God gave me this congregation, and so I'm in charge of this space. So I got to make sure nothing goes wrong here. And of course, that's defined by my sensibilities. So if I think we should be out in the street talking to every stranger and inviting them to Bible studies, then that's going to be the standard. And I'll find the word for that. Or if I think working on unity and or church attendance or whatever it is, and none of those things are bad things. It's simply the idea that I'm not acknowledging the fact that, number one, this is God's work with this person. And number two, he created them in a unique way. Now, because we're here, he's brought us together. There's something about the way he works with me that will work with them too.
Yeah.
But it takes the pressure. But where dogmatism comes from is this sense of, how am I going to make this work? So I'm going to take control of it, you know? And the answer isn't just stop being dogmatic. The answer is start releasing and trusting him.
When our kids were little, I remember very early on realizing you can't treat all your kids the same. And I just thought that was how you did it, was that's what's fair, is you treated everyone the exact same. But I would realize one of the first things that showed up was Clark processed things differently. He needed to be told, Clark, get dressed. And then, Clark, you need to clean up your room. And then, Clark, you need to brush your teeth. If you went in and said, Clark, get dressed, clean up your room, and brush your teeth, you would come back and he wouldn't have done any of it. And now if that was Quincy or Carson, I would have thought they were being disobedient. And that would lead to a different conversation. But with Clark, like I realized, when you give him a long list of things, it's like you gave him nothing. And there was just something about his reaction when I'm getting angry with him that said, hey, Dad, maybe you should try that again. Like it was on me. And I feel like as leaders, that is the easiest thing to do, is just assume it always needs to be this way. This is how it worked with X person. And so this is how it ought to work with you. This is the rule we made with this. So now the rule ought to be the same. And man, that's just not the case. Even if that feels so safe, to be able to rely on precedent. Well, how did we handle this last time? And man, there's just not a place for that in ministry.
Yeah. Well, and man, that's so good. And the biblical basis for that statement that you just made is God worked with every single person in the Bible differently. I think we gloss over how differently he handled his relationship with Abraham than Moses, than Joseph, than David, than everybody, you know, Peter and Paul, different relationships, you know, and I that man, you're so right. It's that idea that whatever my disposition, my conviction, what rises to the top that's most primary for me, I think anything less than that in somebody else must mean they're not even walking with God, or they're not serious about it, or this place is just not organized enough, or whatever it is. And I really wish we could all transport back and walk with Jesus for 2 days. I think 2 days would give us enough with the apostles there, and we realize this is much more haphazard. I mean, this looks, when people say we want to be a first century church, if you mean trusting God so that they can kill you and you'll still hang to him, great. Yeah. If you mean structurally, you do not want to be the First Testament, New Testament church. You don't want to be the first century church, because they were not organized like we were at all. And this is the dynamic that I think we get off track. But the point there is, even the differences, and you don't have a lot of detail, but when Paul is dealing with church in Antioch versus church in Ephesus versus church in Philippi, again, we don't have a lot of detail there, but the detail we do have, you're like, wait, they're dealing with different things. He's not even answering the same question. Now, sometimes he is. In different places, there's a question that applies in multiple states. Like take Titus and Timothy's situation, where Paul is answering about elders. The funny thing is, he gives a different answer to Timothy than he does to Titus.
Yeah.
Why? Different context. Paul is not. I don't think it should blow our mind. At least the way I was raised in church, that Paul writes a different letter to all these churches. Why not just one letter, Paul?
Yeah.
Just one letter. No, he writes a different letter to all these places, And I think that's important to know.
With the qualifications of elders, I think one place talks about that they should be fathers of children. They should have children who believe. And the other one is they should have children that are not unruly. And so why would that be? Well, maybe one place they've got older Christians, and one place they've got really young Christians. And it's not a matter of, are your children believing yet? It's just a matter of, hey, can you run your house well?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We want to have the right list of check the box. I always think of Luke 15, of the shepherd that leaves the 99 and goes after the one. And we make that the defining thing of what Christians do, is you do whatever it takes to go get that one. But then the very next story is the prodigal son, and the dad doesn't go after the one. The dad stays home and waits. That is so hard to know. Okay, so this time do I go chase them into the ditches, or this time do I stay home and let them learn their lesson?
Yeah.
And I think Jesus did both.
Yeah, that's the thing. And that's certainly something you have been really good about communicating patiently with us, is that idea that I can almost always find a justification in the New Testament from something you did. Okay. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think we need to be looking for justifications in the best way, or rationales that say, okay, here's what I see Jesus doing, here's how I'm applying it to my life. But when we say, and that's the only way to get it done, we are denying the actual word of God itself. That there's so many times that if we're willing to be open to what the Bible is trying to teach us, and not just what we concluded, 20 years ago, and we'll notice, wait a minute, this is a very individual journey with the same group of people, with the same gospel. And I think that needs to speak to how we lead in our churches. Back to the original thought, the way that Julia and Eli interact with the gospel is totally different, totally different. And that would have really frustrated me had I known that, 18 years ago, where I was really trying to figure out, how do I get this done? But now it feels freeing. Julia and I will have conversations that are very different than the ones I have with Eli, and to let God work in those is beautiful, because God shows up. I don't have to master that material. I just have to share the truth God has shown me and let him work. And it's that gap of, do you trust God to parent your children? No matter what age they are, but especially as adults, or do you feel, I know a lot of parents of teenagers, they'll notice things are going wrong, and so they tighten up. Instead of releasing, they tighten up because they realize, oh, it's not going well. And I think Jesus would say, hey, I didn't tighten up on my apostles, and they all left me. They all left me at my most important moment. They deserted me, except for John, bless his heart, and it works out because Jesus trusted God. Now, they still had free will. They could have rejected at any time, but he invested in loving God alongside them, and they saw it. And I think that's really, really an important message for us. Okay. Yeah. Oh, you're muted.
All right. So Oklahoma's economy must be opening back up, because there are so many airplanes flying over my head.
Very good.
I had something, but now I've lost it. So go on.
Oh, okay. Well, I think I'm good. Any last thoughts? You said you lost that one, but any last thoughts?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, this next week you're tackling Philippians 2.
Yeah, Philippians 2.
That's correct. So I'm looking forward to that. And I have a question that I want to ask you real quick. You had said before I preached Philippians 1 that there was something that you were grappling with, or something you disagreed with that Paul said.
Yeah.
And I haven't heard of this.
I kind of think we may have talked about this last week, but I'm not sure. It was when Paul says, no matter what, as long as Christ is preached.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah,
I just
that
didn't,
was,
I didn't know if that was the one. Okay. Yeah. Good.
yeah.
Yeah. So my answer is I feel that. I'm with you. I know it's a perplexing thought. So
Yeah.
anyway. All right. Thank you so much, man.
All right. God bless.